So I'm particularly pleased to welcome on your behalf Professor Amy Tsui. Amy is the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Vice President Teaching and Learning at the University of Hong Kong. And I think it's right to say that you've also spent some years working in Singapore, so you know the situation here well as well. Amy assists the Vice Chancellor in setting the direction and policy for teaching and learning at the university, including language policy. And she's the author of some 8 books and 100 or so articles on the question of language policy and language teaching. One of her books, which is published by Cambridge, is as a demonstration copy on the table at the back, and they're taking orders, and I hope that many of you will take advantage of that. So we're now thinking policies into practice. What can we learn from experience elsewhere? And we're very pleased to welcome Amy Tsui. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you everybody for making time to come here. It's a great honor for me to be here and to be associated with Cambridge examinations and of course Cambridge University Press. What I'm going to talk about, I'll try to limit it to 40 minutes, although the slides probably, if I go through all of them, is going to take an hour. But I really would like to leave time for questions and comments and sharing of ideas from you. A bit of the background about myself, just very briefly, relevant to this symposium, is the fact that I have been involved in the some of the policy implementations in Hong Kong, and I was sharing my experience with Peter and Isabel last night about the highly emotional sort of years in which Hong Kong switched from English medium instruction in schools to mother tongue education, and what are some of the complexities involved. So I found the experience very enriching for myself and helped me to understand the complexities a lot more. I'm going to start off with a newspaper, something that I access on the web, and this is an article that the New York Times published, and it's written by the former president of Harvard University about how we should prepare American students for the future. And basically this is how New York Times highlighted that English is global, so why learn Arabic? And in this article, Lawrence Summers said that international experience was essential, but English is global language, you've got all this translation going on, so why bother to learn a foreign language? This actually attracted immediately over 200 very critical responses. And these are just some of the examples, and you can see that these are people from all walks of life. And I'd like to share 2 excerpts with you. One I actually reproduced in the handout, in the paper, in your folder, and it says, what would Aristotle think? And of course, as we know, Aristotle's written about language and written about language and meaning, and how in fact language is very much integral to the person, and that it would be ridiculous to see language as something which is external, which can be divorced from meaning, from culture, and from your identity. So this is basically what he's described is very interesting about a campus in Abu Dhabi, as it says in the 2nd paragraph, where students, the Russian and the Chinese students, are taking chemistry from an Israeli professor. And then across the hall you have Hungarian, Argentine undergraduates taking math with a professor from France, and American, a Qatari student studying anthropology with a Latino professor. So what is happening here, and I think he's portrayed it very well, that students were switching effortlessly from one language to the other. And if you're looking not in the next 5 years, although we are actually there already, but if you're looking ahead 20, 30 years down the road, this is not just happening in Abu Dhabi, it's happening everywhere in the world. And so this is what he is saying, is that Lawrence Summers would tell these students to get over it. A command of English and translation machines the size of an iPhone is all they need to succeed. And he says Aristotle is turning in his grave. What he then, this is not the end of it, it's too long to reproduce it, but he ends his response with the following insightful remark, and I'll just quote one sentence there. He said, learning a foreign language is about a way of being in the world, not about getting the next deal done. And I think that is a very, very insightful remark, that it's about a way of being. A way of being is the way you see yourself, the way you relate yourself to the rest of the world is your perception on the rest of the world. And this is why in studies of bilingual education, it always talks about a broader outlook. It talks about intercultural understanding. It talks about intercultural respect as well. So that is very important. And here, very briefly, is from a headmaster. There are many principals in this room. And this is the headmaster of an international school who says getting by just isn't enough. That if you think that you can only get by, you can get by speaking English, then you've actually missed out a lot. You have missed out the opportunity of attaining a deeper and richer experience. And it says here, years of learning a language, as well as the history and society of places where that language is spoken, develops a student with a truly multicultural outlook. Our global society is increasingly in need of individuals who look at issues with a broad perspective. And I thought the concluding remark was very good. Getting by with languages simply isn't good enough. Would we apply the same kind of thinking to learning science and mathematics? Would we say that science and mathematics, never mind, you just get by? Okay, so with that, what I'm going to do in this presentation is to look at the various models of bilingual education worldwide, because more and more we come to the realization that not only is it not sufficient to speak one language, it's not sufficient even to speak two languages. We're now talking about not just bilingual competence, we're talking about multilingual competence, or some people called it plurilingual competence in the individual. So what I'd like to do is to say, let us look at some of the commonly adopted models of immersion or bilingual education and look at what research tells us about these, the effectiveness of the implementation. And then to ask ourselves, why is it that some of these findings do not agree with each other? And why are there inconclusive and even conflicting findings? What are the mediating factors? And what do we need to pay attention to if we want to try something out in our own country or in our own city, etc.? I mean, I was talking to our Mongolian delegates at the table. They've just started it, and it's very, very young. And there are so many questions about what should we do? What would be the way ahead? And I hope that this presentation will give you some ideas, and I'd like to welcome questions and suggestions from all of you. First of all, the Canadian French immersion, I think everybody is familiar with that. So I'm just going to go very quickly down these bullet points. The aim is additive bilingualism, that is you handle both languages well, one adds to the other and not subtraction. And in many places we see students attaining one language and lose their mother tongue. And this, of course, is a widespread concern in the USA. And in Hong Kong, I can see that happening. And I believe in Singapore, dare I say, that this is probably also happening. And it's something that we're very concerned about. L2 is the medium. When we talk about immersion program, then you really talk about 50% or more for immersion. But of course, for bilingual education, there are different models. And this is not to say that unless you have 50%, then it's not going to work. I think it depends. The L2 curriculum parallels the L1 curriculum. And I'll come back to this point later on, that the teachers are bilingual and L1 is the majority language. That is, the students are able to speak the language outside of that the L1 of the students is the majority language, that they do have exposure to in the community. And that was the characteristics which were outlined by Jim Cummings and Meryl Swain when they did started this immersion program. But as we know, that in the current model, very often this is not always the case, that the L1 of the student might be a minority language. So basically the models are, and those of you are familiar with these models, if you will bear with me, we have the early total immersion, where it's the first 3 years from kindergarten to grade 2. It's all in the target language, L2. And then as you progress, the amount of L1 increases and the amount of time, all the subjects in L2 decreases. That's the early total immersion. Early partial immersion, as the name implies, that from the very beginning is half-half. Then what you see the movable bars there. It shows that the variation in the percentage of the immersion. The middle immersion is when it happens in grade 4. And there are certain bits where the L1 is still there, but for the most part is L2. And in some cases you have the 2-year late immersion, where you have the immersion for the first 2 years of secondary education, which is grades 7 and 8. And then you start increasing the amount of L1 instruction. In places like Europe, for example, where there is a concern for students acquiring more than 2 languages, you actually get double immersion. That is, you have 3 languages. But this kind of model is still relatively few. Then in the United States, they have the variation of the Canadian model is a 2-way immersion program. And typically it started off with Spanish and English, as you know, because of the large number of Latinos, that the Spanish being their mother tongue. So they have what they call the 2-way immersion. But what this is saying is that this model addresses the concern that Latino children, when they go into the English mainstream schools, lose their mother tongue. And so in order to retain the mother tongue, they have this 2-way immersion. And typically, the aim is for bilingual and biliterate competence. They also want the students not to suffer in their academic achievement, and they should also develop cross-cultural competence. And they have roughly equal number of students in in both languages in the same classroom, and the instruction is done through both languages. That's why they call it two-way. But in the last 10 years, with the rise of Asia, and particularly China, you see more and more Chinese English two-way programs. They also have Korean English and Japanese English as well. So that's just a diagrammatic representation of the Chinese English two-way immersion. In Hong Kong, the model that's adopted is late immersion, where the L2 immersion starts at grade 7. In primary schools, English is taught as a subject, and then it's adopted as a medium of instruction. But of course, that in 1997, after the change, the handover, 3/4 of the schools were required to teach through the medium of Chinese. And it's from secondary 1 to secondary 3, then from secondary 4 onwards, which is grades 10 to 12, it's really up to the schools. So some schools opted to have what is called late partial immersion. That is, that when they get to forms 4 to 7, some of the subjects are taught in English and some of the subjects are taught in Chinese. And of course, there were a lot of resistance, a lot of objections from the community about mother tongue education, and the government has introduced what they call fine-tuning the mother tongue education model, and has given a lot of flexibilities to schools. In Europe, as Peter introduced, the form of bilingual education is content and language integrated learning, CLIL, where it's the teaching of content through the target language. And Peter is an expert in this area, so if you have anything about CLIL, ask him. Okay, and roughly now it's about 30 to 40% of the primary and secondary students in Europe receive CLIL tuition. And the teachers, CLIL teachers, some of them are subject teachers and some of them are language teachers, and sometimes they collaborate. Okay, and the subjects adopting CLIL, they have put them into 3 subject groups. One is the science group, which is biology, physics, and what have you, the usual science subjects. And then they have the humanities subjects, and then the creative art subject. But a quick survey of what schools are doing in Europe shows that most of them tend to use CLIL, English, which is a foreign language, which is mostly English in natural science and social sciences. The lesson time is not stipulated, but it ranges from 10%, 20% to it can be as high as 50% or 2/3 of the time. So what are the concerns of immersion and CLIL programs? Number one is, what is the impact of L2 immersion on first language, on the mother tongue? What is the impact of L2 immersion on academic achievement? Are they learning as well, as competently as students who are educated through their mother tongue? What is the effectiveness of L2 immersion in developing L2 proficiency? Then, of course, apart from these educational concerns, in the larger community, there is the concern about cultural identity, about national identity, and whether the use of a foreign language is going to erode or undermine cultural and national identity. And this is very much the concern in Japan and in Korea. When English was introduced, initially when it was introduced earlier into primary education, there was already serious concern. When it was suggested that English should be adopted as the medium of instruction, there were some very, very emotional responses to that. And Peter was talking about issues like that in his presentation, about not divorcing these issues from the classroom, because they do have an impact on students' attitude and on their on the ways in which immersion programs are being managed. And in fact, Hong Kong is a classic case where it's a highly politicized issue. What does research tell us? The Canadian experience is probably known to a lot of us, that it says that the most effective model is in early total immersion. Okay, that's the students who started very early on in total immersion develop a very high level of proficiency in French, and they are actually able, or they were found to be able to catch up their English proficiency very soon after English was introduced in the later years. If you remember the model, that starting from grade 3, the amount of L1 increased, and they were saying as soon as that happened, they were able to catch up quite quickly. And the students developed near native proficiency in receptive skills, but they lagged behind in productive skills, especially in grammatical accuracy. That was in the later research. In the earlier research, the focus was very much on oral proficiency and the receptive, not on oral proficiency, sorry, it's on the receptive skills, on listening and reading. But as it progressed, they found that in fact there were problems with productive skills, and I'll come back to that in a moment. What does the US experience tell us? That for the two-way immersion, Lindholm Leary conducted a study, and I've specifically chosen their Chinese English programs for illustration here, because these are two very different languages, okay? And how did that work? So what the study was done on 2 schools, one adopting, in one school, and I referred to that as or she referred to that as it was referred to as program 1, that the students came from average to low income families. Actually, about 25% of the students were from low income families, and about 50% of the teachers have college degrees. Whereas so the second one, the students are mostly from middle class, high income families. You see the issue about how important socioeconomic status comes in here, and that's why it was particularly designed that way. And most of the parents have college degrees. And the findings show that in both programs, the students attain intermediate to high levels of proficiency in both languages, and were able to use the 4 language skills in a variety of contexts. So the research was saying that that it seemed that the program works for students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. But what is very interesting is that the students in the Chinese program, TWI programs, consistently achieved either at the same level of their TWI, non-immersion peers in the same school, or well above the state grade level of their non-TWI counterparts in reading and math. Okay, so in the same school, they are on a par, but at the state grade level, they are well above. That's the US experience. The Hong Kong experience tells a very different story, okay? And this is an often cited a piece of research conducted by Herbert Marsh and Howe at the Chinese University. It was often cited because it was a large-scale study of 56 schools and 12,000 students. And these schools and students were selected by government as a representative sample, okay? And it is truly representative. So they compare the students' academic achievement in English, Chinese, and then 4 content subjects: math, science, history, and geography. okay? And the tests were standardized, and the achievement tests were actually designed by specialists in the subject. So I think it's quite rigorously designed. What they found was that the positive effect of English immersion on the students' achievement in Chinese and English, particularly the latter. What is very interesting here is the positive effect of English immersion on Chinese, okay? Then there is slightly negative effect on math, but very negative effect on geography, history, and science, okay? And the impact is equally negative, irrespective of whether the students were initially more able or less able. Because in Hong Kong, the schools at the time when the research was conducted was categorized into 5 bands. And the English medium students were in band 1. These are the top students, okay? And then a lot of the Chinese medium students were in the other bands. But the negative effect on students was irrespective of their academic ability. However, students who had higher English proficiency initially were less disadvantaged in geography, history, and science. The next point is interesting. The strong emphasis on English in English classes had a positive effect on achievement in all 6 subjects. And for history, the negative effect decreased somewhat. For science, it decreased somewhat as well, but to a lesser extent. But it did not decrease for math and geography. Okay, so that's a Hong Kong experience. Okay, so let's come to the Chinese experience. This is the China-Canadian-US English immersion, which began to take off in about 1997, started in Xi'an. And now there are about 50 schools like that in the major cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Xi'an, and about 30,000 students. I'm citing a study conducted by Chang et al. In 2010 involving 3 schools with nearly 1,000 students from grades 2, 4, and 6. About 600 students in immersion and about 380 in non-immersion classes. And English medium is used for English arts, social studies, and science, but math was taught in Chinese. And they took school-based tests and the Cambridge Young Learners English tests. Okay, so Isabel should be quite happy about this. They're using that as a measure. The findings show that the immersion students did better in all 3 grades, grades 2, 4, and 6. For math and Chinese, the immersion students did better only in grade 6. And for math, the immersion students did the non-immersion students did better in grade 4. Okay, and this is quite interesting. And what the researchers said, they could not quite understand why the immersion students did better only in grade 6, but not in grade 4. What is happening there? Something is going on in grade 4. And whether that has got to do with a developmental issue, okay? But the findings of Chang et al. Seem to converge more with the general immersion study. It seems that the Hong Kong experience was the one that really stood out, okay? So why are there such conflicting research findings? Okay, first of all, despite these conflicting findings, one positive outcome of all these studies is that the students in immersion programs are able to achieve a higher level of proficiency in both L1 and L2, okay, compared to their counterparts in non-immersion programs. What this suggests is that the bilingual child has developed greater sensitivity to language and may have a more flexible mind compared to a monolingual child. And just now in Peter's session, there was a question about cognitive flexibility of kids. And in fact, there have been quite a lot of research done comparing bilingual children, young children, non-bilingual young children, and they were asked to carry out various cognitive tasks like manipulation of objects and being able to spot differences in shapes and so forth. And it showed that the bilingual child was much cognitively more advanced. And this is actually not surprising, because if you think about a child, a monolingual child compared to a bilingual child, and if you give them, even as they are learning at word level, there are certain words in English where you don't have an equivalent in Chinese. And you have a Chinese word which doesn't have an equivalent. And the meaning is a bit different. And initially, children would see them as the same. But as they grow older, they begin to make finer and finer differentiation. Let me give you an example, very interesting example of a primary classroom. When the students were talking about a sort of an ancient Greek story, right? And the students had to write the ending of a story. And they said, what is going to happen to this to this lady who was, you know, sort of tricked by the god of a bad god, you know? What is going to happen in the end? So they said, oh, she was able to get a new life, and she was able to grow plants, and they have to decide what they grow. And they said, oh, they will grow rice, they will grow fruit. And one child said, no, they don't grow rice. They don't grow rice. They don't eat rice in that country. And so they said, yes, they grow noodles. But you know what the child was thinking? He was thinking about spaghetti. But he doesn't know the word. It's there in the mind, but the word was noodles. And another child said, no, 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 I know what, fries. They eat fries. It's French fries. Okay? So you can see that the range, the way they make differentiation of things that they eat. And the whole classroom discourse was full of examples like that. Okay? So that's just an illustration. However, what we see here is that Jim Cummings in 1998 article reviewed 30 years of L2 immersion, and he drew the following conclusion. He said the development of additive bilingual and biliteracy skills entails no negative consequences for children's academic, linguistic, or intellectual development. On the contrary, although not conclusive, the evidence points in the direction of subtle metalinguistic, academic, and intellectual benefits for bilingual children. Okay, I'd like to put a question mark there on this conclusion. And I'm saying, is that too much of a sweeping generalization here? If we look at the research findings that I shared with you, then probably drawing that sort of conclusion is something that you might want to take with caution. The reason why I'm not sort of disagreeing with that. I'm suggesting that before we draw that conclusion, in interpreting these results, we should have some explanation of why there are these conflicting findings. First of all, I'd like to suggest, because it really depends on the focus of the study, of what is the goal of that research. A lot of the earlier research focused on bilingual achievement. Okay, so there's a lot about L1 and L2, and we have seen that as far as bilingual achievement is concerned, yes. But when it gets to academic development, then all sorts of other things come into play about learning science, learning mathematics. A lot of the studies also focus on math, but as you can see that math very often has got a lot to do with symbolic manipulation, which is probably less dependent on language than subjects like history or social sciences. Which is what I'm saying in the second point, that it's language-heavy subjects. I wouldn't say that math is independent of language. I would say that it's less language-heavy. So I would want to suggest that these are the mediating factors in implementation. First of all, it's age for in immersion and the stage of learning. That makes quite a bit of difference. Is it early, like starting from kindergarten, or is it late immersion? The reason being that if you start very young children in the kind of learning that they're involved in very often deals with very concrete objects. They deal with everyday interaction, and there's a lot of redundancy in the environment. And there's a lot of visual aids and objects which will help them to acquire the language. And the kind of language that they have acquired would mostly be what Jim Cummings would call the basic interpersonal communication skills. Some of, I think a lot of you are familiar with. So it's relatively easy for them to pick that up. But when you get to secondary education, I mean, the fact that there is this division between primary and secondary, which is worldwide, has a reason for it. There is a reason for doing that, because as you move to secondary education, the concepts, you're learning becomes more abstract. It becomes more decontextualized. And the demand on the students to grapple with these concepts becomes far more demanding. So if we were, again, I was talking to some of our friends here, saying that can you actually start using a target language to learn in secondary schools with no previous learning of the target language? Now that gets very, very difficult, okay? The amount of curriculum time and duration, for example, is it just sufficient to have 10%, 20%, or is it later on an example that I will show you that in fact if the duration is very short, then it actually undermines the effectiveness. What are the students' initial L2 proficiency, which I mentioned just now? Parental support. Teachers' L2 proficiency and language awareness, absolutely important. And the teacher's explicit attention to language in English and content teaching. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm going to run through this very quickly, because I think the teacher's language awareness and focus on languages is very important. I'd just like to give an example. I've got that spelled out in my paper, but in the interest of time, I'm going to just briefly mention this. This is talking about the teaching of science, okay? And a PhD student of mine did a study on the teaching of science by science teachers who are language aware and not language aware. The language aware teachers are those who do understand what it takes in order to help students to construct scientific knowledge in English, okay? And the issue about, he was looking at grammatical metaphors, but grammatical metaphor is a concept proposed by Halliday, which talks about how in scientific English, there is a process going on in which one grammatical class is substituted by another grammatical class. And what he's talking about is nominalization, which is noun phrases. So typically, scientific language has got a very heavy use of noun phrases. So what we're trying to do, if those of you who teach science through a second language will know that students have terrible problems and they tend to memorize and rote learn. And that is because the language of science has not been unpacked properly for the students. Okay, so for example, the process in everyday English, a scientific process is represented by a clause with subject, verb, object, and so forth. But in scientific English, it's collapsed into a noun phrase. Okay, so what is needed then is for the teacher to unpack that. And let me give you an example of how this was deconstructed. So this secondary 2 teacher was teaching neutralization. And the book says neutralization is a process by which an acid is added to an alkali until it becomes neutral, or vice versa. The products are salt and water. So that's the definition of neutralization. What do students do? If they actually do not understand it, what they do is they memorize. And that's why there's a lot of rote learning. But this very effective teacher, what he did was that, first of all, he tried to unpack it. Neutralization is a process. What is this process? Acid neutralizes an alkali. Okay, that's a clause. And you see that the verb, the action verb is actually embedded there, or vice versa. Acid is added to an alkali until it becomes neutral. Then the next step is, what is an acid? What is an alkali? What is a process? Okay, the ION indicates a process. So a process, you don't use a verb, you turn it into a noun. Okay, and then what does neutral mean? You neutralize, active voice, or neutralize by. What is the salt? What does pH value mean? How does adding acid to alkali or vice versa result in salt and water? Do you see what I'm saying here? So it's unpacking that. Okay, then for scientific English, what happens is that you then turn a process into a thing. Once you turn it into a thing, you can say a lot about this thing. So for example, neutralization is exothermic. Okay, this is a Form 2 student. Now what does that mean? Then you have to unpack exothermic. So neutralization is no longer a process, it becomes a thing that you can say a lot of things about. Okay, so this is an illustration of how important it is for teacher to be able to focus on the language which is specific to that subject discipline. And in order to help students, you have to be able to provide that kind of linguistic scaffolding in order to help students learn. I'm going to skip this because of the time. What is happening here, and which I highlight as the neglected aspect of the L2 curriculum, is that in the L2 curriculum, typically in schools, focused a lot on everyday knowledge. And there's very little on educational knowledge. So you see a gap between the English that they are learning, maybe 8 lessons, 10 lessons in a week, which is about a third. And the rest of them, they have to use English to learn science, mathematics, geography, what have you. But the English curriculum, or the L2 curriculum, is not supporting the subject curriculum, okay? And this raises a question of how the L2 curriculum must be reviewed and redesigned in order to support the teachers, the students. Another point I'd like to make here, which emerged from these findings, is that there's very little study on the quality of teaching in immersion and the impact on student learning. Okay, there's a missing link there. But what we found, and my own research and my PhD students' research, show that very often L2 is simplified to the extent that the cognitive challenge is reduced. And in fact, Cummings made exactly the same observation for French immersion programs, where there's a very high dropout rate because the teaching was poor, because it was not cognitively challenging. Okay? There's a lot of teacher talk, and the teacher, in order to get an answer from the student, will ask a lot of closed questions. We all have that experience. You ask a question, an open question, there is no response. What do? You change it to a closed question. You change a what, why question to a what question. You still don't get a response. What do? What do? You ask a yes-no question. And the student either said yes or no. And the teacher said, at least I'm getting some response from the students, okay? It's either yes or no. But my own analysis of what is happening there is you see that the cognitive challenge becomes a reasoning question, becomes a factual question, then it becomes a choice question. And it's not challenging anymore for the students. And this is an opportunity lost. So this is kind of learning encourage reproduction rather than learning for understanding. I'd like to conclude this presentation, and I'm sorry I've overrun a bit already, that what I'm saying here is that the outcomes of bilingual programs are mediated by a number of factors, including but not restricted to students' L1, L2 abilities and their stage of learning, the language and content teachers' L2 competence and language awareness, the mutual support between the L2 curriculum and the content curricula, the language support in the learning environment inside and outside of the classroom. And I'd like to say that it's very important to review critically the mediating factors in the local context in implementation. There should be flexibility in implementation, and that teachers must be empowered to exercise their judgment, because really teachers know best what happens on the ground and what works best for their students. I think the worst thing to happen is to say, well, this is the requirement and you have to follow the requirement, without allowing room for teachers to experiment and try out what they think would work best for their students. Thank you.